Good evening, viewers, and welcome to another edition of the JB&SALIM program. Today, I want to continue this discussion we have started last week on different thematic areas, different thematic issues in relation with respect to developments in the oil and gas sector. Now, in the previous program, I would have mentioned that we're going to be doing a series of programs on the oil and gas, focusing on the oil and gas sector. Now, before I go into the discussions for this evening, I want to apologize to our viewers who were looking out for our program last week. Unfortunately, last week we were unable to have our regular broadcast. But nonetheless, we're here, and so we're ready for this discussion with you. Last week, the last session rather, we presented a cost benefit analysis of the proposed gas to shore project. And I did a fairly detailed presentation and explain the the elements and explain the methodology how I arrive at the net benefit position. And the sections of the media, in fact, the one media house carried a story on that presentation, um, which was then picked up by a regular commentator, a commentator who is also a, a publisher, the owner of another media enterprise in Ghana, and who has a weekly program where that commentator slash publisher slash entrepreneur has a weekly program, and in my view publishes and spread a lot of misinformation about certain aspects and developments in the oil and gas sector, and specifically to that gas to shore project, arguably so. And I was fortunate or privileged to be invited on one of that program with that individual, where I thought I had the opportunity. I was hoping for the opportunity to to bring greater clarity of how I would have derived the cost benefit analysis and how I would have derived the net benefit over the life of the project. However, I was rudely interrupted many times without having adequate time to adequately. I was unable, rather, I was rudely interrupted on many occasions, and thus was unable to respond adequately to the questions posed. However, I'd like to use this opportunity nonetheless to continue that discussion that we started the last time we had this program, and to use this forum to to add some more clarity on that presentation or that analysis. Now, one of the questions asked was, how was I able, how am I able as a financial analyst to determine whether the project would be feasible when the cost for a number of other infrastructure and other cost elements are not yet determined. And my response to that was, while we do not have the cost for all the full project cost, we do know that the cost for the pipeline infrastructure alone at this point is an estimated 1.3 billion US. Now, what are the other cost elements? The other cost elements would be the cost for the development of the onshore infrastructure. You might need to add access roads and the supporting infrastructure. You have to build out the supporting infrastructure, the surrounding infrastructure, things like road access and so forth, developing the land perhaps if necessary, um, and the actual infrastructure and equipment and all of that. Then there is a price for piping the gas to shore, which I explained in the previous presentation, that would be a recurring cost, which would be considered part of the operating cost of the project and not necessarily part of the development cost of the project. Now, notwithstanding the fact that the final project cost is not yet finalized, that does not prevent an economist, an analyst, an academic, or any finance professional from performing what I would say a pre-feasibility study or or a preliminary feasibility study or a cost benefit analysis. And a cost benefit analysis is part of what makes up a feasibility study. And I would have used the opportunity to explain that a feasibility study has fundamentally two components. One, there is an economic component, and two, there is a financial component. That is apart from the engineering aspects of the study, the geotechnical engineering, the environmental studies, and all the other important elements that would make up a feasibility study for that project in particular. The gas study, the master the utilization plan for the gas, and whether um, all the other fields have sufficient gas to pipe to shore. So far, according to ExxonMobil, what we know is that Liza Phase 1 has sufficient gas to pipe to shore to bring the required amount of daily volume um, to run that gas plant to those facilities and to provide and has a life for a minimum of 25 years. So let me explain what is the difference between economic viability and financial viability. Now, to determine the feasibility of any project, and a project of this particular project of this magnitude and scale, and um, it is important for it to be both economically viable as well as financially viable. Now, for a project to be economically viable, economic viability concerns whether this project will bring benefits, tangible benefits, intangible benefits, indirect benefits, direct benefits to the wider economy at large. And examples of those would be in this particular specific to this project, the fact that more than 90% of energy generation right now in this country is generated by the use of fuel which we import. If we could generate 90%, if we could replace that with natural gas, or if we could replace 90% of that with natural gas, we could save foreign exchange in our fuel import bill. We could reduce our fuel import bill, which has other um, implications on a macro stability standpoint in terms of strengthening the macro stability fundamentals of the country, where, for example, you have a stronger exchange rate, you have a stronger reserve, because most of the foreign reserve in the central bank right now is used to pay for fuel imports, right? Which is over 600 million, the latest figure for last year. So that's one, and that has broad implications for the country, um, for businesses and for individuals. Stability of currency, exchange rate stability, right? Availability of foreign exchange, right? To conduct um, transactions and strengthening our macroeconomic stability fundamentals. Another benefit, another economic benefit that can be derived from the project is the ultimate objective is to provide a cheaper cost of energy. Is to bring down the cost of energy, reduce the cost of energy by, let's say, a minimum target of 50%. Now that's the minimum target, rather, right? So if you take a few of the largest public companies and you look at their balance, you look at their annual reports, and you look at your operating costs. Now, from working in the private sector, we know that if you speak to manufacturers will tell you that energy cost accounts for about 30, sometimes in some cases 50% of the operating cost or production cost of manufacturing companies. Now, if energy accounts for 70% of production cost, and the objective is to reduce energy costs by 50%, then you could calculate what would be the savings. One could simply calculate what would be the savings in production cost from from an energy standpoint, right? Energy, the electricity bill alone, one could calculate what that savings would be, and times it by 5 years or 25 years. That would be a benefit, an economic benefit to the country. That means companies, by virtue of that savings, would be able to have greater economy of scale, would be able to be more competitive. Um, their products would become more competitive on international markets. They would have more liquidity available to finance, to improve their operations, to improve their processes, to improve efficiency, to invest in the resources to do so, and they have more liquidity available to expand their operations for new investment, right? That in turn creates more employment, provides more employment. That's how you create employment opportunities. Without investments, you can't create employment, right? When the students graduate from university, they have limited jobs, and so you have to invest in these things nationally, you know, so that you can encourage companies, local and international companies, attract foreign companies to come and invest, create new industries because of a lower operating cost environment, a lower cost environment. And so by so doing, you create thousands of employment opportunities for people. Then you pay taxes, PAYE, NIS, the corporate taxes. Then companies have to have what you call corporate social responsibility programs, right, which is giving back to the community, giving back to society, investing, and there are a range of um, social initiatives that companies spend back in the society on, for example, sponsoring training, donating to sports. These are important things for our country, to stimulate and to foster development and to help our country to grow to another level. And that's just a few to explain. So it was not a magical cost benefit analysis. You don't need to be a magician to do it. They're real, based on real data and realistic assumptions. And that is how you build a feasibility study. A feasibility study, financial components, economic components are based on assumptions, realistic assumptions, pragmatic assumptions. So the idea that it is impossible for me to determine that this project would have a positive net benefit when you take all the cost into consideration, that is an impossibility, or that is the work of a magician, is total nonsense, right? And because what I said to the the critic who said that this is not possible for me to do, then by the same logic, how is it possible for him to determine the full cost of the project is not yet finalized, the full benefit and cash flow projections, the revenue stream, and the benefit analysis from the real studies, and not available. So how then are you able to determine that this project is dangerous for Guyana? It will bankrupt the country. It doesn't make any sense. In a likewise manner, if you're saying a finance professional can't determine the net benefit of a project, the cost benefit of a project, um, then in a likewise manner, you can't determine that it will be bankrupt for the country. It will bankrupt the country rather, and it will be dangerous, and it will be a white elephant, and all these, negative views, right? So, everyone is entitled to their opinion and views. We live in a free society, but at the same time, as a Guyanese professional, and as make it worse, the owner of a publisher of a of a media house, you have a responsibility to to ensure the information and the insights and the opinions you feel you put out there for the public's consumption are not misleading, are not misinformation, are not um, you know regarded as, well, I don't want to say propaganda, but gross misinformation, right? And so I could justify, as I've just did in a simplistic manner, justify the cost benefit analysis, justify the assumptions, which I believe are reasonable, realistic, and pragmatic assumptions. Yet, other critiques of a different view, who hold a different view that this thing would bankrupt the country, they can't justify their position. They can't justify their analysis. There isn't even any analysis. Okay? So you, the viewers, you be the judge. You, the viewers and the readers who consume, who process all these information that come your way. You be the final judge, right? When you look at it logically, rationally, and critically. Okay. The I want to also comment on something else, on something that made the headline in today's paper, in one of the, in fact, the same media house I'm referring to. I just don't want to call the name because this program is broadcast on TVG 28, so I have to be careful of what I say and who and how I say what I say. So I am avoiding calling names, right? But I suspect those of you who pay attention, who pay keen attention to what's happening in our country, who pay keen attention to current affairs, would quickly um, know who I'm referring to, right? And so there's an article published today by a so-called international energy economics and financial analysis think tank. And this is a foreigner, not a Guyanese, who did some financial analysis and reported to the Guyanese people that based on that analysis, that the developments that ExxonMobil is undertaking will will become a debt burden to the state. In fact, they broke it down to the extent where it was said that each person, each um, Guyanese would be carrying the equivalent of 9 million US, right? Based on their calculation of a US $75 billion figure. I don't know how they arrive at that figure. But that is grossly inaccurate and nonsensical. And let me explain to you why. With all the hype that we see certain advocates, certain lobbyists, certain commentators, certain newspaper publishers and media houses, and certain groups, the emergence of new oil and gas network groups that has now emerged and are protesting and are calling every day for a renegotiation of the production sharing agreement and for Guyana, for Exxon to give Guyana more. No one, none of them are explaining to you, the Guyanese people, to you, the viewers, the history which at the outset one should appreciate when taken into consideration with all the complexities and dynamism of this global industry and this global economy that we operate in. No one is explaining to you that while we might think it's we're doing a great patriotic deed to write ill and to put all kinds of negative um, views about Exxon and its production sharing agreement out there to the public. If it wasn't for the persistence of Exxon 20 years ago, or perhaps more than 20 years ago, then we would not have been having this conversation today. 20 years ago, right? The first contract that Exxon had is the 1999 production sharing agreement. Following that 1999 production sharing agreement, shortly after they commenced exploration, until 2015. Then is when oil was discovered in commercial quantities. So for all this time, 15 years, 1999 to 1999 to 2015, no one was talking about there is oil exploration happening. No one was beating up Exxon and telling them that, look, if you find oil, you need to give us more and all these sort of things. But now we're beating up the oil company, we're beating up the government of the day, and putting all these negative views out there rather than focus on accepting and appreciating the fact that, you know, production sharing agreement, the fiscal terms in it, it's not the worst in the world. It's relatively decent when you take into consideration the 2% royalty, the 50% profit share, and because of the 75% cost recovery threshold, when that development cost is recovered, the profit share goes up. That means Guyana's take goes up, profit plus royalty, right? We are fortunate that with the lack of ring fencing, we've had not more than three dry wells, so we are fortunate that you know the impact of that would not be great on the bottom line, right? So no one is focusing on the fact that for 16 years before Exxon struck oil, they were pumping money into this exploration. They were investing money. And then when they struck oil 15 or 16 years later, it took another 4 or 5 years to develop the fields before they start producing. So for 20 years, explorations from signing of the first production sharing agreement, then exploration 15 years, then production phase, development phase. 20 years later, now they're producing 20 years later to generate revenue to recover their development cost. So Guyana did not put a cent in there. So if we did not, as a country or a government, invest a single dollar, how could we be plagued with a debt burden? How could we owe Exxon? We don't owe Exxon anything. Exxon is the contractor through the PSA framework. The oil company is the contractor. Um, the country, the host country, you know, the country, the oil belongs to the country. We own it, but we don't have the capital to develop it. We don't have the technology. We don't have the resources. Exxon does. So they're the contractor, and they brought the money. They've been investing since before they discovered anything in commercial quantities, and so they have to recover from the sale of crude as they produce, right? The sale that is generated from that crude, 75% goes towards cost recovery. So the government don't have to go into the treasury, or the government don't have to go and borrow money to pay Exxon. If Exxon was exploring and they never found anything in commercial quantities or anything at all, then it was Exxon money that would have been lost, not Guyana. They took the risk, they're the contractor, and so it would have been their loss, not the people of Guyana, not the country. So that is, the first thing I want, that is the next thing I wanted to clarify importantly to you. The kinds of misinformation that are published in the local certain sections of the local media by all kinds of so-called experts and financial analysts and all these, you know, coming here not knowing the local context, knowing nothing about Guyana, knowing nothing about our political and economic history, knows nothing about the economic state of the country, knows nothing about the macroeconomic fundamentals of the country, and they make these pronouncements that are negative, but are at the same time divorced from reality, and they're grossly misleading and grossly false. Okay. With that said, the main topic for today that I want to talk about, um, since I don't have my co host with me, Salim, today, um, I don't think we need to exhaust the full hour of this program. We might finish in less than an hour because this is the last thing I want to talk about now, which is the main topic for today's program, and that is the case for a national oil company. Now, let's understand some important um, some important realities with respect to a national oil company, right? Now, in one of the vice president's press conference, when he was updating the nation on developments in the oil and gas sector, he would have revealed to the public that in relation to the remaining oil blocks, the government is currently weighing their options. They're currently considering whether they're going to auction, put the remaining blocks up for auction and sell it, give it, award it to the highest bidder, or whether they're going to set up a national oil company. Now, following that comment, right now, the decision is not made as yet. The decision will be made in September, according to the vice president. Now, following that statement, the International Monetary Fund came out and said that a national oil company is not good for Guyana without any justification of substance. Then there was a former advisor to the former president, who also came out and parroted what the IMF said, again, without any justification of substance and tangible, meaningful justification. All they said is that a national oil company is not good for Guyana. And there is a third analyst whom I happen to share a few panels with from the market intelligence from a Latin American market intelligence firm, who also um, suggested that a national oil company might not be the best thing for Guyana, and suggested that a production sharing agreement with better fiscal terms might be better, would bring better um, results and value for the people. Again, but not a lot of substantive justification for that position. In fact, the justification given was that countries that have state-owned oil companies are not democracies, are communist, dictatorial, monarchy type regimes. And I find it hard to fathom how does the the political system, the type of political system or the state or political economy, whether it's a democracy, whether it's a dictatorial regime, whether it's a communist, whether it's a monarch, how does that have an implication for the business model of the state-owned oil company, of a state-owned oil company. Now, while that statement may very well have merit, in relation to all that has to do is with the only thing that has to do in relation to an oil company, a state-owned oil company, is in those types of regime versus a democracy, it has to do strictly with the political system and you know the model of political power and control. In a democracy like ours, political power and control is sort of, there is a balancing effect or neutralize. Well, maybe I shouldn't say neutralize, but there is a balancing effect by virtue of having an opposition. And in our case, the government has a one-seat majority. So it, you you can't say that the government in a democracy has 100% political power and control in such dispensation. So that is the difference. That is the main difference. The level of political power and control and the type of political system of those countries. But with respect to the pure business model, business model and operations and investment agenda of a state-owned oil company, you know, is not affected, right? It's not affected, right? In any fundamental ways. So, having said that, having said that, I want to share with you some empirical information, some empirical evidence, where this is not the opinion of me, but this is, empirical empirical research that is saying this with respect to the history and the changing dynamics of the global oil industry with state-owned oil companies versus multinational oil companies, right? So let me read two quick paragraphs for you, and then I'm gonna explain what this means, and then I'll talk about the pros and cons for Guyana, and end by making the case for a national oil company. So historically, right, major oil companies such as ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, British Petroleum, not only the planned investment in reserves located in the Middle East by allocating production shares to the various territories in which they had concessions, but also to control the market from the point of view of prices, right? So, internationally and historically, these multinational companies enjoy controlling rights, controlling production, and controlling the market in these territories that own the oil reserves. But as of the late 1972, these companies, of which there are about seven companies, including ExxonMobil, five were American, controlled 91% of Middle East output and 77% of the non-communist world's oil supply outside of the United States. In this respect, US companies controlled the vast bulk of the supply of oil to the key allies of the United States. According to the Financial Times, the new Seven Sisters, the most influential energy companies from countries outside the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, are Saudi Aramco, Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, Brazil, and Malaysia. Almost 4 decades later, big oil companies has been pushed into the role of competitor with state-owned companies. As part of this power shift, there is a contest about framing the rules for competition and regulation in the international energy system. Saudi Aramco and ExxonMobil remain entrenched at the top of the 100 leading oil companies based on a composite set of indicators. Further, there is a growing perception fueled by big oil that state-owned companies, national oil companies, have an unfair advantage over them because of the diplomatic and financial support that they get from their government. And lastly, state-owned energy companies will become even more important in coming years. According to the International Energy Agency, in the next 4 decades, developing countries, most with state-owned companies, will be the source of 90% of all new supplies of oil. According to a Rice University study, state-owned companies already control almost 80% of the world oil reserves and will dominate the market in the future. So, if you pay keen attention to what's happening, the proponents who are against a national oil company are proponents who are sympathetic, either overtly or covertly, towards the big oil companies, the big multinational oil companies like the ExxonMobil. And why? For obvious reasons. Because globally, state owned oil companies are becoming more and more powerful. And so the first, if in looking at the pros and cons or the advantages and disadvantages of a state-owned enterprise, a state-owned oil company, the what it gives the state, what it allows rather, is for greater participation and greater control, right? Um, so what would be the risk? In the current framework, in the current production sharing agreement model, Guyana takes on almost zero risk or minimal risk. We didn't have to put up any money, we didn't have to take any loan. Exxon put up the money, Exxon operate, and we get a profit share and royalty. So by having a national oil company now, it means Guyana will now be taking on some of those risks. Okay? But with a model that was hinted, whereby it will not be 100% state-owned oil company, there will be a strategic investor with an oil company, perhaps from the Middle East, right? That then mitigates the risk. So with that model or that structure, again, Guyana don't need to put any money. We don't need to put any money from the treasury. The strategic investor puts up the money, they operate it, right? The risk will be shared, obviously, right? Because it's in the form of a company, right? But We don't have to put up any money. We own the reserve. The reserve belongs to Guyana. So that is what we bring to the table. We bring the oil resource, the reserve, and the strategic investor bring the money, the capital, and the resources to go find it, to explore, to develop, and to produce it. Right? So, and then again, by virtue of having more control and dominant control, and in this sense, increasing our participation at the decision making level, naturally the fiscal terms will be more favorable to Guyana, to the country. Where, for example, in the current fiscal terms of 2% royalty plus 50% profit share, we could increase our royalty. We could increase it to 5% or 10% using the Local Content Act formula. The ownership structure could be 51% Guyana, 49% strategic investor, or Guyana could be greater than 51% based on the negotiations. So we get profit, we get more royalty, and we get taxes, corporate taxes, right? So those are some examples of the pros and cons of a national oil company, right? So even though in this model, Guyana will be taking on some of the risks, albeit those risks could be mitigated. There is more control over the resource and decision making, right? We don't have to put up any money. The strategic investor could put up the money, right? We get more terms. The higher the risk, the higher the reward. So fiscal, we get greater fiscal value, increasing your royalty, increasing the profit share, and then the company pay taxes, right? And then there there is generally three types of goals that these all companies are set up to pursue, or the business model, I should say. One, cash cow. Two, profit seeker. Three, a state supplement. Now, in our case, we could have a combination of all three. We could have having a hybrid, so we're mitigating the risk of what the critics are saying by virtue of a strategic investor in terms of the ownership structure, um, and then the goals of the national company, right? Where in goal number one, the, with the cash cow model, in that case, total transfers to the state is maximized. So various transfer ratios per barrel, percentage of revenues, etc., are the performance metric. So overall government take from the sector is maximized from a revenue standpoint or from a cash flow standpoint. Then the profit aspect of it. So we can have a combination in terms of framing the goal of this enterprise that draws from the cash cow concept, the profit seeker concept, and the state supplement concept, where in that aspect, the idea is where the state depends on specific goals, which has to be aligned to the national development goals, right? Things like employment, increasing the local spend in the economy, domestic economy, refinery throughput, growth of local companies, household energy availability, and so on. So, where, for example, we had to pass a law to get the oil companies to maximize their spend in terms of local content, we got to understand that the value to the people and to the country is not just the revenue, the economic rent, which is in the form of greater royalty and greater rent, profit share and taxes, but also the spend in the economy. The spend, the cost oil, the 75% cost recovery. maximizing that amount of expenditure, spending it within the economy, right? And in the current environment right now, using Guyana example, right? For the period 2015 up to 2020, 5 years, ExxonMobil reported that they spend for $45 billion cumulative for that period on local content or in the local economy. That's that's about 210 million US. As a percentage of cost oil for 1 year from Liza 1, that's less than 10%, just 9%. If you do the math and the calculation, it represents less than 10% or 9% of cost oil or the 75% cost recovery. So the objective of local content is to maximize essentially the spend in the local economy, building into building out the local capacity, building the infrastructure, the support infrastructure, um, to supply the services, the goods and services. So with this framework, by having more control at a decision making level, we don't have to go and pass a law or rely on a law to force or to mandate all companies to have more, um, to maximize their spend in the local economy, right? We could do that by virtue of controlling a national oil company. So where they spend before the oil before local content law in our case was less than 10%. With local content law now, that the objective is to improve to take that up, and we have to do the analysis to see what percentage of cost oil, whether it's 15 or 20%. But the objective by having a national oil company and the model that we are, conceptually looking at, that could increase substantially, which would greatly benefit our people, our local businesses, providing more opportunities for people, more investment and entrepreneurial opportunities for people. So that's the model that we could pursue, which which guarantees, you know, greater benefit for the country from these three dimensions by virtue of having, a hybrid state-owned um, oil company or national oil company. Okay, so this is my small contribution for now in terms of justifying the case for a national oil company. And with that, I'm almost 5 minutes to closing time. So with that, I'll bring this program to an end for today, and I'll see you next week to continue this discussion. You have a great evening, and thank you to our sponsors, Ktor and Spurix Professional Services. So thank you again. Good night.